But hello, everybody. My name is Brian Anderson, and today is part two of our cybersecurity series. We're doing this, fall, winter, summer. Today, we're going to be talking about securing identity and SaaS for the most part. We wanted to bring up our faces just for a second so you know we're not bots. Dustin helped me with this content, and he's going to be speaking a little bit too. Dustin, do you want to show us your full-on hacker hoodie look? I
Oh
noticed
yeah,
you're
I
wearing a
got
hoodie.
blue team mode. Here we go.
Oh, that's scary. All right, so I don't know what else to say at that point. Oh, we also have Adam Sabota on, who did the first part of this security series. In part one, it's on YouTube if you missed it. We got really good feedback on it. Adam went over a lot of the offensive tooling that he uses when he does pen tests. So he focused quite a bit on on-prem AD. He did discover and talk about some cloud stuff as well. But really, part two is kind of the complement to that. Instead of focusing on some of that on-prem security, we're going to be talking about securing identity, Azure, and SaaS. And then in part three, we're going to kind of tie together everything we were showing in part one and two and show how we've got that bundled into some solutions and give you some outcomes. So here's the agenda for today. In a nutshell, we want to highlight the dangers that exist in this modern SaaS world, outside of the data center. So we're going to cover the basics of modern auth, the types of attacks you can expect, as well how to mitigate them. A couple of points before we get off this slide. This was kind of a passion project for Dustin and I. I don't think either one of us closed this presentation for the last 2 weeks. I also don't think I've ever been less certain of how long a presentation is going to take. It's a lot to cover, and we even had to take out a lot of stuff that we really wanted to cover. So it's going to be a little bit of an experiment how fast we roll through this. The other thing I wanted to point out is that a lot of our examples are going to be Microsoft centric. The reality is that's where our expertise lies here at Eagle, and that's where a lot of our services live in. But I did want to point out that if you're using Duo, Okta, any of these conditional access services, really the risks, the examples, and the mitigations are all relevant. So I hope that you'll still get some good stuff here. So I don't want to spend much time on this slide because, like I said, we have a lot to cover. But really, the takeaway and the reason we always broach this is that we believe security is a part of every discussion nowadays. And really, the biggest point is that when you buy a solution or even change a setting, that's an opportunity to improve or degrade your security posture and even your recoverability. And I actually think that's on full display today as we get into some of these examples. So let's talk about the attack on identity. We felt like it was necessary to step back a little bit and first talk about how traditional or on-prem or Kerberos authentication works. So here's the basic workflow when you're on-prem. It starts with a client requesting access. So he sends the auth request. He is granted a ticket granting ticket. That's a mouthful. He uses that TGT to request a service ticket from the ticket granting service, the TGS, and then ultimately he's going to use that service ticket to access a server resource. So once again, we're really thinking client to server. Adam went over all the different ways you can attack Kerberos in part one. I've got some of them listed down there in the bottom right. But really, the takeaway that I wanted to have here was just you're not going to get tested on this, but just to remember how this works when we talk about what we're going to do next, which is go over modern authentication. One thing to call out is that in this world for many decades, you've been really comfortable putting your username and password into any app that asked for it, right? And there was just some sort of trust that app wasn't going to store that data or do anything malicious with it. With the model that we're about to show you, that's been avoided altogether. So here are the basics of modern authentication. So specifically, we're showing OAuth 2 through an authorization server, Azure AD or Microsoft Entra in this case. But the way it works is one application sends a request to Azure AD. You are authenticated. You're granted an access token, or I should say the application is. And then that originating application uses the access token to request access to another application resource. And so these tokens are somewhat similar to what we just went over with Kerberos. But what's unique about them is they carry information like what rights the user has and when those rights expire or when those tokens expire. The other big takeaway is that these are called bearer tokens. So that literally means whoever has the token can take advantage of the rights embedded in that token. Yeah, obviously, you can see where this is going and why that's important as we move through some of these examples. And then, of course, the other call out is we're not living any longer in a client to server resource world with this type of authentication. We're living in an application to application world in this reality. So I would have liked to have delved in this more because we really believe that understanding how OAuth and these modern authentications work gives you a real good window into how they can be manipulated and how you can lock them down. So to that end, if you've got the time, I'd recommend you spend 16 minutes watching this fabulously bearded individual from Okta go over the basics of OAuth and OpenID Connect, which is a layer on top of OAuth that gives you those SSO capabilities. Think of it as your identity badge. But he's a great teacher. His greatness in teaching is only matched by that beard. So Dustin, if you wouldn't mind, maybe you can throw that link down in the chat.
Yep.
Thank you. So let's get back to that on-prem security model. You guys are all really familiar with this, right? It's this notion, it's often called perimeter security. We like to call it castle and moat. But basically, all your protected stuff is in this castle, protected by the moat, and you're hoping that keeps the bad guys out. Well, obviously, over the last 6, 8 years, the bad guys became much more sophisticated, motivated by Bitcoin, and they started finding ways to get through that crusty exterior. And that's really what caused the growing popularity with endpoint detection and response. We recognized that they were going to get in, and we wanted to detect them as fast as possible and mitigate the threat. So, this is a world you guys have all lived in, you know pretty well. But where we're moving into or living now is a world where we still have Kerberos. It's not going away anytime soon. We still have this castle and moat, but now we have what Dustin on our blue team often calls guerrilla warfare. So now we have all of these interconnected apps. They have these persistent tokens with different rights and privileges to each other, to your corporate data. And of course, the bad guys can just be scattered anywhere in this ecosystem. So one of the big takeaways today is that while you still need endpoint security inside that castle, there's a huge need for identity security outside the castle. So that's really a lot of the stuff we're going to cover today. One other thing that we just wanted to point out before we get into talking about some of those common attacks is the fact that you still need to protect both worlds. So it's very common for someone in an on-prem environment that has elevated their privileges to then find ways to attack and get into your cloud infrastructure. Here we have a really popular example where a bad guy on-prem with elevated privileges is going to get into your Azure AD Connect server, right? If you've had Azure AD Connect set up for quite a while, you're probably using a highly privileged account. It's usually excluded from MFA. We're talking global admin levels of privileges. And so once they get that account, they're going to get into your cloud tenant and wreak havoc as well. We'll talk a little bit later about limiting blast radius, but I would also point out it can go in the other direction. Somebody that gets in your tenant can then use that information and those identities to get their way on-prem. So it really is important to protect both and to understand that if one's weak, the other one is weak, once again, due to the fact that they're both connected and syncing. So let's talk about some common attacks that leverage some of the, I guess I wouldn't want to call it a weakness, but some of the ways that tokens work and this modern authentication works. So token theft should be pretty obvious, right? That's the unauthorized acquisition of a security token. Through token replay, it allows them to access protected systems without any sort of single sign-on or MFA prompts. We don't need your password at this point. Consent phishing is something we're going to give a functional example of later, but that's a malicious technique where attacker tricks a user into granting application permissions inside your tenant. And there's a lot of havoc that can be wreaked there as well. We don't see SIM jacking much, so I'm going to sail by that. MFA fatigue is well known. Maybe you got someone's username and password off of the dark web. They're reusing their passwords, and you basically keep hitting them with MFA requests until they hit yes. An adversary in the middle attack is something that we've talked about frequently in the past. It's highly sophisticated but automated. We're going to give you an example of that on the next slide, but essentially it's a way to get a token from a user even if MFA is enforced. And then you have some methods that even Adam employs when he does some of his external pen tests. The first is a breach replay. So that is where you use dumped passwords off of the dark web to target specific users to see if they're reusing those passwords. There are also password sprays. That's where you hit a broader audience, but with a smaller set of common passwords. And then finally, there's phishing. Everybody knows what phishing is, and you'll see that in the next example as well. I do want to call out one thing as it relates to phishing. A lot of our users have been educated on phishing, but in a very email-centric focus. So we're going to show you later in the presentation how the concept of phishing can be really applied anywhere. So I'm a big fan of examples. They help things kind of solidify in my head. So let's give you an example of what's either called a BEC, business email compromise, or a financial fraud attack. So this attack starts with just your traditional phishing in the inbox. They click on a link. They believe it is taking them to a legitimate login page. But this is where the adversary in the middle attack happens. This bad guy is using something called Evil Gen X. It's a man in the middle attack framework. It's included in Kali Linux, by the way. But essentially, we present that user with a login page that looks legitimate. They type in their username and password, and then we forward that. We're in the middle acting as a proxy. We forward that to the legitimate website. That triggers an MFA authentication. The user hits yes because everything seems legitimate. And then at that point, we either forward them to an error page or we can redirect them to a legitimate page. But unbeknownst to them, we now have their username, their password, and a token that likely doesn't expire for 60, maybe even 90 days. So we've seen this with our own customer base of customers that we protect. And what happens between the lightning bolt and the star usually takes about 30 seconds. The bad actor will set up persistent OAuth connections to various SaaS services. He'll set up his own MFA source so he can log in the future if his token expires. He'll do all sorts of mailbox forwarding and recon. He might set up his ability to send email on that user's behalf. And then what you see after the star on the slide is kind of a quick way this can play out. But the reality is that usually 3 to 6 months passes right there where that star is. And it's also the delineation between machine speed and code and hands-on keyboard time. So I think the worst example that I've talked about multiple times is a CFO once got hit. They sat there for 4 months just observing who he was, how he talked, who he talked to. And when he went on vacation, they reached out to procurement and they convinced procurement to put $5 million into an account where it was never seen again. So these seem like fairly sophisticated attacks, but once again, they're all operated to run with code at machine speed. And only until it's something that is valuable in the bad actor's mind do we actually get any hands-on keyboard time. So how do we stop this nefarious stuff, right? Oh, by the way, that's the second reference to Starship Troopers. You should put in the chat if you saw the first one. So conditional access policies almost have to be discussed before we can talk anything else because they really play into the other examples. They pair with MFA and they evolved out of necessity as a way to protect those tokens. So think of conditional access as a policy cop for all things authentication related. I've got a number of examples there listed on the screen. But really, you can think back to that BEC attack that we referenced. The person that logged in and the person that stole the token and used token replay, they were probably on different sides of the world. So that's an easy conditional access policy to write. If some sort of impossible travel occurs, you're going to revoke those tokens and you're going to cause that user to have to log back in and provide MFA. Would have stopped that bad actor in his tracks. One question that we get from customers a lot is, hey, can I get a one-time service just to make sure all my conditional access policies are following best practice? And unfortunately for Eagle, the answer is no, because conditional policies require constant attention. So we're going to give you an example of that here in a couple of slides. And then later on, Dustin's even going to demonstrate how to set up a conditional access policy that's fairly robust and protects those highly privileged accounts out in your Microsoft intratenant.
Yeah, and I would add in here too, Brian, that Microsoft saw such poor adoption of conditional access policies. I think last year they announced in the fall at Ignite that only 40% of customers were actually using them properly. And so they've gone and started enforcing it on your tenant. So you might actually see policies that are pre-built by Microsoft in a ready state, ready to be turned on at a certain date in the future. So they see the issue as well. So we just want to call it out and make sure you're all aware, check those policies.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Once again, it was kind of a necessary evolution to secure your environment, and not enough people are taking advantage of them, right?
Yeah, MFA is just not enough.
Yeah, so typically when we talk about telemetry and security, it's in reference to like post-mortem and retention. And we are going to discuss that next. But there's a lot of common logging inside Entra that's really good to know and be familiar with, because you can also use it to verify that your MFA and conditional access policies are functioning as intended, right? So first is sign-in logs. That's going to show where a user is coming from. It's going to show what device they used, what MFA policies they had to pass to get in. Audit logs are going to show changes to accounts. So once again, getting back to that BEC example that we gave, that would actually register when a phished user's account added a bad actor's authentication method. So as opposed to just proactively looking at logs, we're going to give you an example of some of the logs that you typically see. The point being that on the left, once again, you see that basic but valuable information, who it is, where they're coming from, what MFA they had to use. But on the right, you actually see which conditional access policies triggered. So this is why you really can't think of conditional policies as a one and done. There's constantly new features and capabilities coming out. In fact, we had a conversation before this presentation if we were even going to talk about one in one of Dustin's examples. But the notion here is you want to go in, and if you see users that regularly are able to bypass MFA, or you see conditional access policies that aren't applied to all logins, some tweaking needs to occur, right?
Yeah, and it could be something as simple as basic authentication is still turned on. So it's a huge hole still in your organization. And you can tell from these policies and these sign-in logs just how that basic auth is bypassing CA policy. So that's another big one to look out for, is basic auth needs to be turned off. So
Yeah, and typically when you onboard customers, that's a lot of the first things that you work towards, right? Is
yep.
fixing some of these holes that have been opened up through what we're going to talk about here in a little bit. We often call insecure by default.
Yes, sir.
All right. So the other reason that you need a lot of telemetry is for postmortem. I always like to say there's two jobs when you have a breach. The first is mitigation and recovery. The second is postmortem. Well, postmortem needs generous retention and logs. So in Microsoft land, they do a really good job of generating a lot of telemetry. But if you look at this eye chart here, you can see that based on the plan that you have, none of them have good retention. The average soak time is around 6 months nowadays. So really you need about a year of logs so that you can go back in time, figure out how they got into your environment, and prevent them from doing that in the future. A lot of our larger customers will go spend quite a bit of money on something like Splunk so that they can aggregate those logs and retain them, search against them, and alert against them. And that works really well. But we wanted to kind of give you like a pro tip today, like a quick fix here. If you go into diagnostic settings on your tenant, you can actually forward or aggregate those logs to something called the Microsoft Log Analytics workspace. And if properly set up, you can retain up to 2 years of this telemetry, of this aggregated log data. It gives you the ability to search against it. You can set up dashboards. And once again, there's nothing huge up front you have to build or buy. So it's a quick way to get that generous log retention so that you can shore up your security posture, especially after a breach.
Yeah, we've included a link on how to do it. So I'll post that link in the chat as well.
Thanks, Dustin. I always forget to mention the links. All right. So we talked about how Entra gets attacked or SaaS gets attacked. We talked about how you can begin to capture that activity, a little bit about blocking it with things like conditional access policies. So we wanted to spend some time on another method of security that we're big fans of at Eagle because we believe the lift or the effort to actually setting up deception is much smaller than the value that you get out of it. So everyone talks about this. We talk about this. Soak time is the enemy. The longer that they persist in your environment, the more damage they can do, right? So deception techniques have a lot of advantages. We'll talk more about lures and decoys on the next slide. But cyber deception is multifunctional. It draws attackers away from your legitimate data. It creates confusion. It undermines their efforts, right? It wastes their time. Some sophisticated orgs even use it to monitor attacker behavior, right? So typically what you'll see is even basic deception will often trip up those less seasoned bad actors, the guys that are using off-the-shelf components. What's also interesting is that oftentimes the really seasoned professionals might just walk away. It's kind of a folksy example, but when I was a kid, every time I got a new car, I would go to Radio Shack. If you don't know what that is, Google it. And I would buy a blinking LED. I'd drill a hole in my dash and I'd put that in there. And I knew that guys would look at that and be like, that's probably not even a real alarm system, but it was just enough that they knew there was something easier down the road. And so we even see that with seasoned bad guys who may know what they're looking at. Another interesting thing about deception is it's one of the only ways to catch insider attacks, right? So maybe you've got Bob in accounting and he's getting offered 5,000 Dogecoin, right, to grab some intellectual property. Well, first off, he should have looked this up. That's only like 500 bucks. But second is he starts poking around the environment, he's going to trip up on these sensors as well. So you're even going to know if someone inside your environment is doing something that they shouldn't be. So there's two basic types of deception. There's decoys. Those are fake devices and accounts that appear in your network. And then there are lures. So that's fake content. So we're thinking documents, configuration files. One of the more sophisticated versions of lures are cached credentials. You go back to those OAuth examples. If they can steal a token, they can replay a token. So we can actually put in cached credentials that will trigger an alert. But as you look on the screen here on the left side, you can see that deception is basically meant to slow them down or altogether stop bad actors in that discovery phase before they're able to move into the ransom phase where they do lateral movement, where they escalate permissions. So it is very effective. Adam went over canary tokens. Those are free and very easy to implement. He even showed a pretty sophisticated way to do it to know when people were messing with domain admin accounts and certificates. Something we're going to cover in the third part is how Microsoft Defender actually has built-in deception technologies. They use machine learning to suggest decoys and lures that are actually tailored to your naming conventions and your network. And then they're automatically deployed and planted, all automated using PowerShell. So we're going to cover that a little bit. And then finally, if you really want to catch even the most awesome hackers, we can talk about something like ThreatWise. That's kind of Spinal Tap Volume 11 type deception, where you're deploying fully simulated items. Like we're talking security cameras with live feeds, SQL servers that return on queries, file servers with real files on them. And it's relatively inexpensive to deploy 40 of those in an environment and really trip up the bad guys. So a lot of this can also exist in the cloud. It's not on-prem only. So in an environment where we have to rely on identity security and we can't rely on endpoint detection and response, deception is a really good way to be tipped off to the fact that someone's in your environment.
Yeah, and I'd add too, Brian, that LSAS credential theft, if you want to go back a slide. So if you have those fake credentials just living on a domain controller, you can disrupt that attack that Adam was talking about in the first presentation, where someone's trying to replay that session or steal the session from your domain controller. So you could find pretty quickly if someone's attacking your on-prem environment with just placing these credentials in the right locations and setting a pretty good trap. So tying it back
Yeah,
to Adam's attack.
good point. And I'm happy to see in the chat that some people are defending Radio Shack. I also loved that place. So I'm not the only old guy on here. So next, let's talk about admin dangers. And that was some sort of popular culture throwout that Dustin did because someone died.
Yeah, the creator of that show died, so I had to, just out of respect. So,
All right, nerd respect. I get it.
yeah.
So once again, we've talked about how we can get attacked, how we can defend. So let's also focus on limiting damage. So this is kind of rudimentary, but I think it's important to discuss. It's the notion that, an admin that has an on-prem environment, that has a cloud tenant or two or three, really needs three accounts. So he needs that daily driver unprivileged user account that is synced to Entra. He needs an on-prem domain admin that is not synced to Entra. And then he needs that cloud admin that's Entra only. It has no tie to on-prem. And of course, this is all about blast radius. We gave that example early on how attacks can start in one of those environments and move to the next environment. I think anybody here will tell you that it's a really bad day if someone owns either environment, but it's a worse day if they can move fluidly between the two. So we thought this was a great opportunity to actually demonstrate a conditional access policy that locks down that cloud admin account. So at this point, I was going to hand the mic over to Dustin so he could demonstrate how that works.
All right, thanks, Brian. Yeah, so like the example showed before, there was a secure workstation little option on there, and that's what we're creating here, right? So inside of your conditional access policies, you can go in and limit. Maybe you do every administrator role that has any sort of potential access that would be, hurtful, and you lock it down to a specific device and require a specific security type. So maybe a FIDO key or some sort of physical key. Right. So what you would do is go into your conditional access policies, define which directory roles you want to target. In this example, we just use a global administrator, and then we'll create a filtered tag, which essentially is just a tag on your Entra device. So if a device is registered at Entra, you can add an extension attribute, any value you want. So for this example, we use jumpbox. So obviously you have a couple, right? Maybe your workstation, maybe you have a secure VM inside your environment on-prem. All tagged with that jumpbox tag. And so then we'll include that in this filter. We'll target all cloud apps, so no gaps remain. And then go ahead and hit next for me, Brian.
Yes, sir.
And then once that's done, you're going to go into the grant section and require authentication strength. So Microsoft, probably in the last 6 months, a year, added this new method, right? It's not the require multi-factor authentication. It's actually requiring a level of protection. So we want to pick the strongest one, which is the phishing resistant MFA. That one requires a FIDO key, right? If a bad guy isn't physically on my machine and physically has my key, they can't use it. So and then we want to also set a sign-in session. So some limits on our sessions. How often do we want our admins to have to relog in? Ideally, you do every time, but not everybody wants to do that, right? You gradually get towards that, but maybe you start with 10 hours because maybe you shouldn't have it open for more than 8 hours, a work day. But by default, these are set to 90. So you log into a browser session, that token stays alive for the next 90 days. So you accidentally do the wrong thing, click the wrong link, and as an admin, your token's now compromised. So definitely want to have session limits in place. And also you want to have not have a persistent browser session, right? Because then if I close my browser, reopen it, I'm still logged in. I don't want that session to live any longer than I'm using it. And that's just to keep that timed admin role elevation to a minimum. So never persist is the better option. There are some other advanced features we're going to talk about later, like the global secure access security that's come out in the last 6 months. But for now, we'll just move on, Brian. Next slide. All right. And so once we have our policy in place, the next thing we need to do is do an inverse, right? So now I want to block every device that's trying to use an admin role but exclude just my jump boxes. So do this part, definitely set it in a report only mode, just so you can verify that you've covered all the accounts. Maybe you have some service accounts out there that still have rights and admin roles that will break if you do something like this. So doing the report only is great. You can go look at those same sign-in logs we showed you earlier, and you can see in the CA policy all the report only triggers. So you can filter by those in a list. So it's pretty easy to see all the different attempts at this policy. And again, the last thing you'll want to do is make sure you have a break glass account. So go ahead and the next slide for me, Brian. So once you have that break glass account, definitely set up some alerting on it. Store it away, make sure it's excluded from the CA policy, has that conditional access administrator role only. And then once you're done, you have a secure device, a secure method for logging in, and a session limit. With this in place, it's much more difficult for a bad actor to gain administrative rights into Entra and do a lot of damage. So that's all I got there, Brian. So next slide.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that report only mode and the break glass account are obvious, but also very key. We've unfortunately had multiple customers lock themselves out of their own tenants. That's not a fun experience because Microsoft is not that responsive, especially out of 8 to 5 hours, to help you fix that.
Yeah, and as far as I understand it, it's very difficult to fix. So definitely make sure you have a break glass account.
Okay, so on to the next session. We wanted to give you some examples of what we often call insecure by default. It's the notion that a lot of these SaaS apps and these vendors typically have default settings that need to be changed, quite frankly. So we wanted to demonstrate the danger in some of these, right? So the first example is, I believe this was the default with early adopters out in Azure AD. But it's the notion that any user in your corporate environment can register an enterprise app inside your tenant, and all of the permissions that app were given apply in your tenant as well. So if you look up in the upper right, you can see that do not allow user consent. An administrator will be required. That is the setting that you should use. Obviously, we're going to show you of how bad this can be on the next couple of slides. But at a bare minimum, the middle setting that's got the smiley face, that will allow users to register low impact applications, ones that just want to understand profile data or email address. But the bottom one, allow user consent for all apps, is really dangerous. And once again, this gets back to the way that OAuth authentication works, the way that those bearer tokens work, and the settings and the session timeouts that can persist inside those. And Dustin, you do a better job of explaining this, but even Microsoft has struggled with OAuth app permissions.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm sure you all have heard or read the news, but Microsoft was attacked by Midnight Blizzard, and under this same method, they had a test tenant, they had an OAuth app that had access from their test tenant into their corporate tenant, and it had full exchange access. So that's a game over for Microsoft, right? So every mailbox is now open for that bad actor, that team of bad actors, to basically plan that next DEC attack, which for them, it was just more intel on how they work. And some code. So, making sure you understand what apps you're connecting and how much permission they have, and auditing that permission is critical in protecting Entra.
Yeah, so let's try to drive this home here. So this is a screenshot that Dustin took in an unnamed tenant for an unnamed enterprise application that had been registered to that tenant. So you don't need to know what this app does or needs to do to know that you're pretty scared by the permissions that go along with it. Once again, Bob in accounting could have added this app to your tenant, and now this app has the ability to read all user mailboxes, to send mail as any user, right? And so for 5,000 Dogecoin, or what, $566, an inside attacker even could have been fooled to just registering this app, which once again gives the owner of this app pretty much unfettered access to parts of the tenant. Really scary stuff, right? So this gets back to that consent phishing example that we gave earlier. This is oftentimes how attackers will attack certain tenants. It's also worth pointing out that oftentimes legitimate applications that you use in your environment may have overly elevated permissions, and all it takes is for them to get owned by a hacker, and now all of their customers are at risk as well. So scary stuff. It's one of the few cases I've seen where a user can apply such broad permissions with the click of a button. So we also had that example, or at least I touched on it, that most users are educated to phishing as it relates really specifically to email. So we've also seen a rash of attacks lately where bad actors are taking advantage of another insecure by default setting inside Teams that allows other organizations to communicate them. And I don't know why I'm picking on Bob so much, but if Bob gets a message in his corporate Teams IM, there's a certain validity or credibility that goes along with it, right? So it's really important to go in and audit this setting. We highly recommend that you set it so that some sort of admin or security vets which organizations can communicate inside your team's environment. And once again, you have to consider that if any of those partner organizations get hacked, they have a way to get inside your network or influence your users.
Yeah, and we've seen attacks. If you give someone guest access into your tenant, there's a CA policy that should require those people to MFA as well, right? And a lot of people don't have that. So making sure you cover that gap, not just from a safe domain list, but also from a CA policy, because we've seen attacks use that advantage and gain full access to environments.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we're actually getting close to done here, and we wanted to have a little bit of fun demonstrating what all of this can do for an organization and what's at risk. So we created these slides called the Tale of Two Coffee Shops. So first, let's talk about, let's go with Bob again. So Bob is just your average remote worker. He logged into his Microsoft Entra ID last week. He's got a 60-day token now because he checked that Remember Me box. Opens his laptop, starts working. He's just flying into all of his applications, right? Because they know who he is and he's got that existing token. And he's probably thinking, life is good. These IT guys have made things really convenient for me. So you can probably see where this is going. So let's go to a different coffee shop on the other side of the world. So now we just have your average remote working hacker. The week before, he owned Bob with an adversary in the middle attack. He now has a token of Bob's that he can replay for the next month and a half. And so he sits down, he opens his laptop, and he starts working through everything we covered in that business email compromise example, right? He creates his own MFA method. He starts forwarding emails. He's setting up persistent OAuth connections. And he's literally thinking the same thing. Life is good. These IT guys have made things so convenient for me, right? So this is obviously the scenario we're trying to avoid. So on the last slide in this example, we're going to let our blue team guy, Dustin, explain what he's done in this customer's environment that stops this guy in his tracks.
Yeah. So in the first example, they used the adversary in the middle attack. It will be blocked by Defender for Identities behavior monitoring. So it'll be an unexpected location, malicious IP address, or just not the device it was registered on. So let's just assume that they get past that step. So how do we protect at the bullet two? So a CA policy with limits on the session and its changing state can completely disable the token the minute that state changes. So when Bob left his house or the office and went to the coffee shop, his token's now dead. So that's one big benefit. Now, let's assume they get past that one. If we have any requirements in our CA policy for a device registration or a requirement for them to be hybrid joined to your Entra tenant, or even just coming from a non-standard location, it would be blocked. And then finally, once they get through step 4, since we're auditing OAuth applications and reviewing that logging that we went over earlier for MFA method changes, we can detect and block this activity. And additionally, if you have the Defender for Office 365, you can do mail forwarding rule alerts as well. So all of these layers can help. That way, if they get through one, you've got the multiple other layers for Bob to be protected.
Yeah, so life is not good for this guy. Bob's protected. These IT guys suck, and he's going to go find some lower hanging fruit, right?
Yeah.
So hopefully that was a good example that kind of solidified how you can really, put all these conditional access policies and limits in place to really thwart some of these attacks, especially attacks that often rely on token theft and token replay. So Dustin, I think you had one more slide you were going to cover right here.
Yeah, so we wanted to talk about the future, right? So our next presentation will go into a bit of the advanced technologies that are coming out for intruder protection, and one of those is called a Microsoft Secure Service Edge. And essentially, what this is a client you install on your endpoints, so laptops, mobile devices, what have you, will now have what I would consider an application level VPN type experience. So if this client is on their machine and you have policies in place in Entra, they're required to use that tunnel. And that tunnel will not go to our business email compromise guy's evil Genix server anymore. That server is not part of Microsoft's global network. So they won't allow you to even touch that device and mistakenly auth to the wrong place. So this is kind of the future and why Microsoft they kind of retooled the entire idea of how you do auth by just putting an application on your clients and make them use it. It also has the opportunity to create a connection into your on-prem environment through this same tunnel. So it's a lot of cool toys inside of here that we'll talk about in the next presentation.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Dustin. We talked about this earlier one-on-one, but it's kind of interesting to see that castle and moat model start to come back in play for all of these SaaS apps, right?
Yeah, yeah. It's now I've got a dedicated drawbridge to come in and out of my castle now, and only go to the one place I want to go. So yeah, it's definitely coming back.